The Hockey Insiders is presented by Scores, where winning dishes are always on the menu. From our supremely delicious roast chicken and ribs to our famous salad bar. Always more at Scores.
I don't think Darren got to hear that whole clip, but that was Frankie Corrado yesterday on Melnick in the Afternoon talking about it, saying there must be some curiosity for the Canadiens to see what Patrik Laine's got. He is close to a return, perhaps ready to return as soon as tonight for the Canadiens in Winnipeg against his former team. Is that actually going to happen? That remains to be seen. Sammy Blais put on waivers by the Canadiens yesterday. It does look like maybe something is imminent. Good morning, Darren Dreger.
Hey, good morning.
What do you think? Is there any curiosity at this point on the Canadiens' part to see what a potentially healthy Patrik Laine can bring to the table?
I would think so. I mean, I don't have a definitive word from management of the Montreal Canadiens, but we've seen what a healthy Patrik Laine can do historically in the NHL. That would be intriguing enough for me, as long as you don't have a big fear as a special teams coach that, his spot on the power play is going to disrupt something that has worked in his absence. But, we know that Patrik Laine, when he's motivated and he's healthy, he can score goals with the big shot. His vision is fine. It's just everything else that goes into Patrik Laine that, I think has earned some question to this stage. But, if he's healthy and you're not putting him in the lineup, then what's the next step? Because nobody is lining up for Patrik Laine, unfortunately, by a trade.
And I wonder if there is something there. I mean, the Canadiens obviously would have to look at salary retention, but I guess also in the same context, it appears as though with the Canadiens, solving issues internally and staying as competitive as they've been, Darren, is it fair to suggest, whether it's now or, there's still a month before the 6th of March, that things have quieted down around the speculation and the Canadiens' potential movement?
Well, I don't know if it's quieted down, Sean, but maybe the big game hunting idea that was injected into speculation early on by guys like me and by mass media was a little hyped at that point. I mean, if you're Ken Hughes or any general manager in the National Hockey League, you're looking for, the most substantial upgrade that you can afford. And your wish list starts with, some of the better players that you think, if they're not on the market, are going to be on the market at some point. And right now we're hours away from the Olympic freeze. So, the deadline is obvious today. And then beyond that, you look at a small window, 12 days between the end of the Olympics and March 6th, the trade deadline. I think that what's happened in Montreal is nothing but positive in that, okay, this team has had its share of blips, but by and large, the group that we're watching on a game-in and game-out basis has really grown together as a team. And from coaching and management standpoint, that has to be considered a huge step in the right direction. So maybe, you kind of lessen what you're willing to give up for the piece or the pieces that you believe that you need, because now all of a sudden you're maybe not looking for that number 2 center as aggressively as you might have been near the start of the year. So I think what's happened here is the few sellers that have been out there are asking for exorbitant prices on some of the players that Kent Hughes would have and does have interest in. And because of that and because of the growth of the team, he's been allowed to be patient, and that may not change.
We've got now just a couple hours till that trade freeze. Are you expecting activity today?
Yeah, I'm not going to say I'm not, but I do think that we have to be careful of what the level of expectation is. My sense as of last night, it's quiet this morning, but my sense as of last night was that we might see some of the smaller stuff that we've already seen to this point. Now, again, the Artemi Panarin situation has been hanging out there for a period of time now, and I think the New York Rangers believed that they would and could have something done prior to the break. That was the whole point of taking him out of the lineup and protecting the asset. But obviously nobody has stepped up, as Pierre LeBrun and Chris Johnson noted on Insider Trading last night, with an extension that is going to encourage Artemi Panarin to waive his no-move clause. So I would wonder, if I was a team with interest in Panarin, why would I do it now, mere hours before the Olympic freeze, right? Let him stew on it over the Olympic break, and and see maybe he's had a change of heart. Maybe he is willing to consider a rental option. And if he's not, then worst case scenario could also come into play for Chris Drury and the Rangers, where he just says, to hell with it. I'm not doing anything. You don't want to play me. That's your choice. You're going to pay me in the process, and I'm going to walk into unrestricted free agency. I mean, that's not going to happen, but the potential in walking into free agency is. I know this guy's a competitor, and we know the teams that have interest, and there's a list of teams that have interest. So I think something gets done, but I think it's a stretch to think that it could get done between now and 3 o'clock Eastern. But I do think that we'll see some smaller stuff.
Any big players on the Panarin front? I mean, there's been lots of smoke around San Jose early on. The Florida Panthers, who have yet to, kind of catch fire. Is interesting listening to Paul Maurice kind of do a State of the Union on where his team is at and looking at injuries and everything else. But is there any significant smoke around a possible logistical landing spot?
Well, we look at Washington for a lot of different reasons. Washington is trying to figure out what the post-Ovechkin era looks like. And, Panarin isn't a young player, but, he can give you, in his mind, he thinks that he's got at least another good 4 years ahead of him, right? And that's why he's put a stake in the ground as to what a contract extension would look like. So could he help bridge the gap in Washington and finish a strong year, and maybe next year with Alex Ovechkin? Let's see what his decision is at the end of the year. So Washington is intriguing to me. The LA Kings continue to poke around, but I don't get the sense that they're as eager as some of the other clubs because, they feel like their bigger need is more at center ice. But, there's a list. The San Jose Sharks, Carolina, of course, as we've already acknowledged. And then I think you've got a bigger collection of tire kickers around them as well.
With Darren Dreger every Wednesday, Friday here on the Morning Show on TSN 690, joining us at about 8:35. I'm Connor McKenna with Sean Starr. We'll dive into a little bit of a Super Bowl midweek preview just after 9 o'clock this morning. Darren, I was watching the Islanders and Penguins last night. About 5 minutes or so left in the game. It looks like the Islanders down a goal are about to head to the penalty kill, but the referees took a moment, conferred, and then said, you know what? That was friendly fire. No power play. The Islanders score the tying goal a few minutes later. They end up winning the game in overtime. Are we seeing signs that maybe this is going to become more of a regular occurrence in the NHL?
Yeah. Yes. And okay, now you've reminded me. This goes back to the bad call on Lane Hudson, that phantom call, right? And I talked to hockey operations, and I talked to Stephen Walken, the head of officiating, and all groups, including Eric Furlat, acknowledged that, that can't happen. Because if it happens in a playoff game, there's obvious repercussions. So how do you avoid that from happening? Well, the only way to avoid it is to do what they did last night. If it's as simple as four guys coming together and having a 30-second conversation, okay, that's not a penalty, then overturn the call on the ice. That's fine. The two refs want to get it right. It is a judgment call. Mistakes are made. But if the official who calls the penalty didn't see what he thought he saw, and the three other guys say, no, here's actually what happened, that individual who made the call would want it corrected. They want to shoot close to 1,000 as best they can. So part of my reporting after the Eric Furlat debacle was that the National Hockey League was going to consider before the start of this playoffs doing what they do with the double minor for high sticking and the major that can be reduced or rescinded. That's just a quick look. Don't include anybody else. Just allow the officials on the ice to have a look at the replay, at the penalty box. Hockey operations does not need to chime in from the room in Toronto. Just allow the officials to have another quick look at it. It's as easy as looking up at the Jumbotron, for heaven's sake. So I think that was a huge step in the right direction last night. And let's see if they tweak it even more and they do incorporate the video review before the start of the playoffs. It gets more complicated because I think you'd have to include the competition committee and all of that. But that was a pretty big step last night.
How big is this Olympic break going to be, do you think, for these teams on the cusp of a wild card in either conference or teams that are in top three positions? I mean, I know the league probably in a perfect world doesn't want to have a 3-week break, but this could set up for an interesting lead up to the March 6th trade deadline with how aggressive the time management's going to be, isn't it?
Agreed. Yeah, it's going to be chaotic, which is a fun thing in our profession because it obviously gives us fodder for conversation. But I think it's going to be frenzied for a couple of reasons. The trade scenarios, that's pretty obvious. But, teams do have to figure out what they're doing with their free agent players. Buffalo, they're not trading Alex Tuck, right? So does Jarmo Kekalainen get to that place with the Bartlett family that represents Alex Tuck where they go, okay, we don't like the idea of paying him $10.5 million on an annual average salary, but he's number 2 in scoring for us. We can't imagine going as deep as we possibly might go in the playoffs, given how wide open it is in the East. So let's just take advantage of a good thing and get something done. In addition to maybe Jarmo does look at other pieces that, could be brought in as part of the trade deadline. So I think what you're going to see through the break, sure, some managers are going to be on their phone on a day in and day out basis, working right through it. But I think the majority of the guys will take the better part of a week off outside of, doing some minor poking around inside that week. But by mid-February, then all guys will fully engage again, start revisiting the trade conversations that they've had, and also, circle back to, if not conversations they've had, reality checks. And I talked about this last night on Insider Trading, the St. Louis Blues. You look at the lineup of players that the St. Louis Blues are willing to consider trading. And it includes Colton Parayko, it includes Falk, it includes Jordan Kyrou, Robbie Thomas, we've talked about before, Braden Shen, again, maybe Jordan Bennington. Well, that's a pretty good group of players, some more complicated than others. The tricky part is that Doug Armstrong, appreciably, his ask on Thomas and some of these other players is astronomical, off the charts, a non-starter, I'm told, by a few different general managers. So they're just waiting in the weeds. The GMs that have interest in those guys are waiting in the weeds, and they have pieces that they're willing to part with, but maybe they make that call towards the end of the Olympic break to Armstrong to say, okay, we know you're busy. Hopefully you're trying to manage this team into a gold medal, but give this some thought. And when the break ends, we'd like to connect on player X. I think that will happen.
What about the Blue Jackets? We were talking about the situation they find themselves in right now. A number of very intriguing names as potential rentals, like Charlie Coyle, Mason Marchment, Boone Jenner, Danton Heinen, Eric Goodbranson on the blue line. On the other hand, they're 4 points out of a playoff spot. They've also, though, had some misfires on draft picks in the last couple of years that haven't necessarily come to fruition. They're at a weird spot. Like, what do you expect from a team like Columbus? And they're not the only team that find themselves in that kind of no man's land.
Well, Columbus is an interesting read because of everything that you've said here, Connor. And clearly they're enjoying the coach bump, bringing Rick Bowness in and replacing Dean Evison. But I think you've got a couple of different camps around the Columbus Blue Jackets. That's not a negative thing. That's hockey operations, working hand in hand, but you need contrary opinion. And maybe Don Waddell, the general manager, shares the contrary opinion that, okay, we're playing well. We're on a 6-game heater right now. We're right there on the wild card line. So do we do what this team has done in the past, the organization that has made mistakes, and hold the assets that you've talked about? Or do we invest in what we believe is going to be a better future with some of our young pieces and move one or two of those guys so that our foundation is stronger moving forward? And I think there's a loud voice, in support of that position. However, you get to that cut line where they're at right now, and it's intoxicating thinking about, oh, geez, how great would it be for the fan base? We're in the playoffs. Again, because of how I referred to the opportunity for the Buffalo Sabres, well, that applies to any team in the East, right? It's so wide open with the Florida Panthers, appearing like they're not going to make the playoffs. So I would get it if Columbus wanted to hold tight but you can't let good players walk either. So they're about to hit a crossroads, and that'll probably be midday on March 6th, the trade deadline, before they've got to figure it out.
You know, Connor and I earlier in the show today were talking about the ongoing saga in Philadelphia with what's going on with Matvei Michkov and how turbulent is the turbulence between the coaching staff and their player. And I wondered to Connor when we were having that discussion, I mean, the allegations of coming into camp out of shape and everything else, I mean, is that a deadly sin in hockey? Not to the point where it's unforgivable, but boy, oh man, it's hard to overcome that. Is that the root of the issue here?
Nah, part of the problem, not the root. You know, I thought what Darren Dreger said in his media availability last night was bang on. And I think that Michkov, you know, showing up at camp out of shape has been blown out of proportion a little bit. And what I mean by that is, I mean, you're talking about these guys are superior athletes. I mean, you can't envision Michkov laying on a beach, you know, eating hot dogs and drinking beers all summer long. That's not reality. You know, is he in NHL shape? No, probably not, because he's not a grown man yet. Like, you know, it takes time, and that was Briere's point, for these players to, you know, to put the time in the weight room and skate and train with NHL players the way that you have to do basically 12 months of the year. So he wasn't in tip-top condition, granted, when he, you know, arrived at training camp. But I think that they obviously, based on Briere's words, have a ton of time for the upside of Matvei Michkov. And the fact that he is going to develop and get stronger and get faster and potentially be the star player that the fan base and a bit of noise from a small group, you know, envision that he could be right now. He's just not there right now. And so many good young NHL players need the time. It's like a 3-4 year journey before most of those players, you know, find their stride. And that might be the case for Michkov. And it's Rick Tocchet's job to squeeze as much as he can out of this kid to make sure that he stays on that path of development. You know, it obviously doesn't sit well with the entire fan base, but the bit of noise created around Rick Tocchet, you know, it's all online based, social media based, and I know the organization isn't taking it too seriously.
The Habs and the Jets tonight. Sean asked us earlier today, what's more shocking, the Sabres 180 and an apparent organizational turnaround since moving on from Kevin Adams, or the fall from grace that we've witnessed out there in Winnipeg? This was a big-time team putting up big-time numbers, at least in the regular season, for years now, and now they could be thinking Gavin McKenna at this point. What do you make of what's happened there in Winnipeg? Is there a fix there, or are they headed for some long-term pain?
Not long-term pain, I don't think, because they've got good players. And okay, it starts with Connor Hellebuyck, who, you know, he hasn't been his Vezina norm this season when he came off injury, but, you know, he's a Vezina winner. So you've got your number one goaltender locked down. You know, Josh Morrissey, a top defenseman, Mark Scheifele, a top center in the National Hockey League, Kyle Connor, a top scorer in the National Hockey League. When you've got pieces like that, you're not hitting the skids for too long. But I do think that Kevin Cheveldayoff and the Winnipeg Jets do have some tough decisions to make here. And I do think that there is going to be a directional change. You know, why wouldn't they pursue a top draft pick if they can find a top first-round pick, or a top 10 pick, top 15, a first-round draft pick? Let's just say that. Especially if you're looking at, say, Logan Stanley, who's on an expiring contract. So there's some directional decisions that have to be made after tonight's game against the Canadiens, and they'll do that over the Olympic break. But I do think it's a transition. And I remember thinking back to the conversation I had with one of the owners for the Jets, Mark Chipman, start of last season, I believe it was, where he talked openly about how this team can't go through a full rebuild. They can't go 5, 6, 7, 8 years and wait for the team to get built up to where they're ready to contend again. So I'm borderline shocked that the Jets went from President's Trophy to missing the playoffs. Nick Ehlers moved on to the Carolina Hurricanes. Some other pieces shifted, but, you know, they had all the good media, in Jonathan Toews returning to the National Hockey League, stepping into that mix, but none of it seemingly has gone right. So that requires the attention of hockey operations. And I do think that they need some help up the middle of the ice, and they've got to find a way to get faster. So those will be the two things that Cheveldayoff is focused on.